In the war-torn skies over Europe and the Pacific, the sight and sound of Spitfires and Mustangs were common. These and other lightweight yet deadly aircraft regularly dominated the enemy and claimed air superiority. These veteran planes had been crafted to be small and agile. However, as the war continued, greater strength and resilience became essential. A new class of aircraft took to the skies. Larger, heavier, and more powerful. A machine that could match the speed and agility of a Spitfire while staying operational even after sustaining heavy damage. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt earned its name well. Built around a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, it was essentially a Titan with wings. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at Republic Aviation Corporation, understood that top performance required the most powerful radial engine available. Pratt & Whitney's R2800 double WASP 18-cylinder radial engine provided the necessary power. With power as a priority, Kartveli incorporated a turbo supercharger beneath the rear fuselage. The four-bladed propeller required a 12-foot, 2-inch diameter, which in turn demanded longer landing gear and guns mounted further outboard. The P-47 was the result of a lengthy evolution process that began with early Seversky designs in 1933. Seversky himself piloted a prototype in 1935, which eventually led to the P-45. By late 1939, a new design was commissioned as the XP-47. But combat reports from Europe highlighted the need for more firepower and greater horsepower. That's when Kartveli took charge. The XP-47B prototype made its first flight on May 6, 1941. After overcoming more than the usual developmental challenges, the production P-47B took to the skies in March 1942. Jackie Cochran, one of the Alexander Seversky's top pilots, continued flying for the company after it was renamed Republic Aviation. In 1937, when most Army pursuit planes struggled to exceed 200 miles per hour, Cochran set a record with a speed of 304 miles per hour at the National Air Show. With Jackie Cochran consistently winning trophies for the Seversky Corporation, the company gained widespread recognition. Seversky himself had also competed but withdrew after an accident ended his racing career. A design modification moved the engine forward by 8 inches to improve stability, resulting in the designation P-47C. By early 1943, production transitioned to the P-47D, featuring an upgraded engine, improved turbo and intercooler installation, enhanced armor, greater ammunition and weapon capacity, and a bubble canopy. Further refinements included an extended dorsal fin. Production was now accelerating, with 3 factories manufacturing P-47s, the main plant at Farmingdale, a new facility in Evansville, Indiana, and the Curtiss-Wright Company, whose aircraft were designated P-47G. Although the P-47's designers accounted for nearly everything, occasional equipment failures required creative solutions. When landing gear became stubborn on approach, pilots often used a practical and effective wing wiggle maneuver. As the P-47's popularity and success grew, so did its design enhancements. The D-series saw improvements like a universal wing capable of carrying fuel tanks, bombs, or rockets, a reinforced belly attachment for heavier payloads, and broad paddle blade propellers for better performance. In total, 12,602 of these models were produced, more than any other aircraft subtype. When the P-47s entered the fray, the Luftwaffe was inflicting significant damage across Europe. The versatile and lethal Thunderbolts were shipped to Europe in large numbers, and their success, along with that of their pilots, was quickly recognized across all combat theaters. The savage and unrelenting battles waged by the Luftwaffe against the Allies were soon met with equal force by the powerful and efficient Thunderbolts. The tide of destruction sweeping through Europe was met head-on. The first operational sortie over France occurred on April 8, 1943. While aircraft losses and mechanical issues still arose, P-47 pilots quickly adapted to their planes' toughness, speed, and firepower. With the development of extended fuel tanks, pilots took full advantage of the aircraft's increasing range, and over time, tactics were refined to exploit its superior speed. The initial roles of the P-47 included high-altitude escort missions and fighter sweeps. Pilots soon discovered that they could outdive any Luftwaffe or Allied fighter, providing them with a critical escape strategy when necessary. When the Thunderbolts made their European debut, radial engine single-seat fighters were still a rarity. The only other fighter operation in Europe comparable to the Thunderbolt was the German FW-190A. To avoid confusion during combat, Thunderbolt engine cowlings were painted white, and black bands were applied around the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces. The signal is given for a squadron of Thunderbolts to take to the skies. What might appear to be a friendly race in peacetime takes on a much darker meaning for these pilots. A war rages in the skies over Germany, and these P-47s are in a hurry to join the fray. Flying in formation, they head toward a confrontation that could cost them their lives, an ever-present thought in their minds. But these men have a mission, and their comrades need their support. The newly arrived Thunderbolts dive into a fierce battle with the Luftwaffe. By this point in the war, the German aircraft had already taken heavy losses from British Spitfires and Hurricanes. Now, with the Americans joining the fight, the German losses in both aircraft and pilots were becoming unacceptable. The intensity of their attacks persisted, but their effectiveness was plummeting. They could no longer maintain dominance over Allied skies, and they had lost control of the skies above Germany. The Allies were throwing everything they had at Germany, with much of the damage inflicted by the B-17. Naturally, the Luftwaffe wasn't far from the B-17s as they dropped their deadly bomb payloads, and these bulky, slow-moving aircraft were easy targets. Just in time, the Thunderbolts swooped in to assist the B-17s, providing much-needed protection against the German assault. Though the flying fortresses were adequately armed, they couldn't outmaneuver the faster Luftwaffe Henkels, so their success relied heavily on the air support provided by the Thunderbolts. While the war raged in Europe, Allied troops in the Pacific were engaged in combat with the Japanese. To conduct air raids against Japan, the Allies captured the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, whose proximity to Japan made them ideal locations for airfields. The heavy bombers needed runways, and after securing the islands, Allied engineers quickly set to work constructing makeshift air bases. The P-47 Thunderbolts played a crucial role in escorting bombers flying from these islands, and large numbers were also assigned to carriers in the Pacific. Though the Thunderbolts weren't originally designed for carrier operations, they performed adequately. There was no intention of landing them back on board, so they were not equipped with landing hooks. Without a runway, the P-47s were loaded onto catapults and literally shot off the sides of the carriers. Thanks to the power, staying in the air was never a problem. By the time the P-47D was developed, its engines produced up to 2,800 horsepower and could reach speeds of 433 miles per hour. Later models could hit 467 miles per hour. Once airborne, the P-47 had a range of between 1,250 miles and 2,350 miles, depending on the fuel tanks it carried. All models had a service ceiling of 42,000 feet. After landing, the Thunderbolts didn't stay idle for long. In preparation for combat, ground crews ensured each plane was stocked with ammunition. As with most of the plane's design, the armament installation was practical, robustly built, and simple to service. The Thunderbolt's increasingly deadly external weapons were also easy to load. Initially, the rocket installations were poorly designed, with accuracy issues, but these flaws were quickly addressed. The P-47 was equipped with 8 0.5-inch Browning M53 machine guns, each with 267 rounds. Later models increased the load to 425 rounds per gun. The bomb load of the P-47 was initially 2,500 pounds, but later models could carry up to 3,000 pounds of bombs and 10 5-inch rockets. In footage captured by the Thunderbolt's test engineers, hundreds of spent shells can be seen pouring from beneath the wings. Needless to say, the Thunderbolt was a formidable machine, capable of spitting bullets at the enemy with relentless, deadly accuracy. In Saipan, the P-47s became the first aircraft to use a new weapon in combat: napalm. Using external fuel tanks as containers, napalm bombs were assembled on site. A mixture of napalm and gasoline was pumped into the tanks, and a detonator was fitted. The Thunderbolts played a vital role in the Saipan, Guam, and Tinian campaigns. The fighting on Saipan extended into the first weeks of July 1944, with P-47s making frequent sorties from the airfield to the battlefield, providing close air support to ground troops. Though the Japanese soldiers on Tinian fought fiercely, they had little chance of success. The Thunderbolts had complete air superiority, and with little resistance, they were free to attack the weary garrison at will. With their overwhelming numbers and firepower, the P-47s efficiently dispatched the enemy in a coordinated assault. When the Thunderbolt pilots unleashed their napalm arsenal on the Japanese forces, victory was all but assured. The P-47's role in the Pacific theater proved devastating to the enemy. But elsewhere in the world, they were engaged in a critical and exclusive operation. In a seemingly inconsequential part of Italy, the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to secure its place in history. On the tranquil island of Corsica, the lives of the peaceful islanders had been upended by Italy's involvement in the war. Dawn. The men of the 57th Fighter Group rise with the sun. This island is now theirs. They prepare for the day with a routine they've grown accustomed to. For these men who have made Corsica their home, At a steady pace, they move through the early morning preparations, readying themselves for the inevitable battles ahead. For these men, today will be much like yesterday, and probably much like tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel Gil Wyman has made his home in a deserted trailer once owned by an Italian general. At just 24 years old, he's in charge of his squadron. Originally from Louisville, Kentucky, his new home is comfortable, with all the modern conveniences. The American residents of Corsica share their space with the French. Though conversation is limited, they get along just fine. Both sides lost a man yesterday, so the flags are at half-mast. A small reminder that, as pleasant as the surroundings may be, these men are still stationed on an active Allied airbase, and the dangers are very real. The 57th Fighter Group is based at Alto Air Base, where 3 squadrons are stationed. The steel mat runway stretches 150 feet wide by 6,000 feet long. The tower's call sign is Breakneck. Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel Archie J. Knight. 65 Squadron arrives for their briefing. It's formal, brief, and to the point. The men sit on bomb crates as they receive their escape kits. These kits include enemy currency and instructions for returning behind enemy lines. The men are then informed of their target. Along the narrowest and most mountainous section of southern Italy's peninsula lies the Gustav Line, where Allied troops have been halted just behind it. The airplanners aim to use their Thunderbolts to attack behind enemy lines, weakening the German position. Their primary strategy is to cut off Germany's supply of troops, fuel, shells, and food traveling south. This operation is called Operation Strangle. Italy's railways form a complex system crucial to Germany's supply lines across the country. The planners of Operation Strangle intend to sever that lifeline. '65 Squadron taxis to their dispersal point at the end of the runway. Their mission is clear. Fully armed and fueled, the men are eager to begin. Though some may not return, each pilot is determined to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy's supply chain. The crew chiefs meticulously prepare each plane for the mission. Clear visibility is vital, and while cleaning the canopy takes little time, it could save a pilot's life. A thorough inspection of every part of the aircraft reduces the risk of system failures during combat, and the crew chiefs leave nothing to chance. For pilots, regardless of rank, what matters now is how much combat flying they've completed. If they haven't flown many missions, they're considered beginners and are referred to as sprogs. They stay sprogs until they've completed a few missions. Once they've picked up a few skills, they're called sports. After surviving 50 or 60 missions and gaining considerable experience, they are promoted to old sport. The top pilots, like Gil Wyman, are known as wheels. No one knows exactly why. The wheels are marked by distinctive tail design on their aircraft. Major Richard Hunziker from Tucson, Arizona, settles into his seat. Having flown 179 missions, he's seasoned. The crew chief won't be accompanying him, but the pilot briefs him on the mission anyway. Though Okuchi can't go along, the pilot fills him in, as this is routine by now. Over time, these men have become friends, and a bit of conversation before the mission helps calm the nerves. The pilots are ready to take off, but they remain grounded. They wait For 5 minutes, these men are given the chance to clear their minds. It's part of the plan. Any thoughts that need to be processed can be done now, while still on the ground. Once airborne, they'll rely solely on instincts and reflexes, and any lingering thoughts could slow their response times. Any concerns about home or loved ones will have been addressed by the time they take to the skies, leaving them focused and prepared to fly. Takeoff is always challenging. The Thunderbolts are heavy planes. A fully loaded P-47D weighs between 15,000 and 17,500 pounds. A mile of steel runway stretches ahead. As the squadron reaches the tower, about halfway down, they are committed. There's no turning back now. The first pair takes off, Wyman and Gustafson. The second pair taxis out, Goss and Burgess. Next are Vandor and Richardson. Finally, Smith and Atwood follow. Hickok and Murrow. The last pair, Elwood and Hunziker. They fly over Corsica, then head out over the sea. Italy lies just 60 miles to the east. After 60 miles, they are 150 miles behind the German front. The squadron moves north, towards the mountains, leaving the castle behind. Leader section. Red section. Black section. The pilots fall into formation, mirroring their squadron leader. He leads the way. When he turns, they turn. Wingtip to wingtip. When he climbs, they climb, always maintaining tight formation. The Thunderbolts carry on-board cameras to capture the action on film. One camera is positioned behind the pilot, capturing both the view ahead and behind. Another is mounted under the wing. Yet another is placed inside the wing, documenting the flight from different angles, timed with the guns in the wheel well. In the instrument panel, capturing the pilot himself. The squadron shifts into a loose string formation, each plane following one another. The leader pulls off first. The rest of the section follows at 2-second intervals. There's no bomb sight on the P-47. The pilot relies on his skill alone to drop the bombs accurately. He steers toward the bomb blasts of the planes ahead. They've already taken out a bridge. Leader section reforms overhead. Red section moves in. A miss. Another miss. A hit. Black section swoops in. Blanket fire over the target scores another hit. The squadron runs out of bombs, but they still have plenty of fuel and ammunition. They ease down to the deck in search of the next target. The squadron locates the railway tracks, a vital enemy supply line for troops, food, shells, and fuel. Destroying this line is paramount to hindering the German war effort. They move in. Following the rivers, the P-47 pilots methodically target and obliterate every rail bridge in sight, ensuring the Germans can no longer rely on trains to move their supplies south. After tracking the rails to a train, the Thunderbolt squadron attacks. Their primary target is the engine, a swift and strategic move to halt the train's movement and make the boxcars easier targets. Next, they destroy the boxcars, likely filled with supplies. The explosions confirm their suspicion. The boxes contained ammunition. With the southbound rail lines destroyed, the Germans must resort to roads for transport. making them vulnerable to further attack. However, the cost of war is evident as one Thunderbolt is shot down. The pilot is lost, and in such situations there's little that can be done. The crews on the ground can only watch helplessly as another life is claimed in the battle for freedom. The harsh reality of war continues, as many more lives will be lost before victory is achieved. Despite the damage, Lieutenant Cheswood managed to fly the P-47 back to base. His plane was a testament to the ruggedness and resilience of the Thunderbolt, a plane that could endure severe punishment and keep flying. The P-47, with its sturdy frame and powerful engine, earned its reputation as one of the most dependable fighters in World War II. Pilots affectionately called it the Unbreakable for its ability to keep flying after sustaining considerable damage. While its shape led to it being called the Jug, some incorrectly assumed it was short for Juggernaut, due to the plane's sheer power and endurance. After every mission, the Thunderbolts often came back riddled with holes and damaged wings. But the P-47's ability to stay in the fight, even when battered, proved why it was a preferred choice for many combat pilots. These aircraft were vital in turning the tide of the war, whether it was supporting bomber missions, disrupting enemy supply lines, or eliminating military targets. Though the P-47's missions were perilous, its pilots trusted their aircraft to bring them back, no matter the damage it took in battle. The P-47 Thunderbolt continued service in the European and Pacific theaters proved essential to the Allied war effort. After its critical role in Operation Strangle, which crippled German and Italian supply lines, the Thunderbolt solidified its place in history as one of the most reliable and versatile aircraft of World War II. The Thunderbolt's ability to deliver consistent firepower while enduring damage without failing made it a symbol of resilience. As the war progressed, the P-47 underwent several modifications to adapt to evolving operational needs. The P-47D variant, the most widely used in Europe, was the workhorse of the Allied Air Force, while experimental versions like the XP-47E with a pressurized cockpit and XP-47F featuring a laminar flow wing explored design improvements. However, the ultimate evolution of the Thunderbolt came in the form of the P-47N, a larger, heavier model designed for long-range operations in the Pacific theater. The P-47N's increased range and firepower were crucial to its success in battles across the Pacific Islands. On Corsica Alto Air Base, where the war seemed endless, the crews continued their relentless missions, striking at the heart of enemy infrastructure and ensuring that the P-47s remained a vital part of the Allied arsenal. The pilots and ground crews showed extraordinary dedication, knowing that the Thunderbolt was often the last line of defense for their fellow troops and bombers. Despite the horrors of war, the P-47's unyielding performance helped maintain the Allies' air superiority throughout the conflict. The pilot's time in combat was intense and filled with the harsh reality of war, but the very act of flying and engaging in battle often served as the only true distraction from the horrors they faced. The adrenaline and focus required to carry out their missions left little room for thoughts of home or the emotional toll of the ongoing conflict. Whether attacking Luftwaffe airfields or performing dangerous strafing runs, the pilots knew their lives depended on their skill, precision, and the support of their fellow crew members. When the mission was complete and the targets neutralized, the pilots followed the disciplined procedure for landing. They would carefully peel off to reduce speed, spacing their planes out to avoid collisions, and making the approach for landing. As they touched down, the ground crews anxiously waited to ensure that every pilot made it safely back. Despite the harrowing nature of the work, the operation had been a success, and the Thunderbolts had once again proven their worth, further cementing their place in history. The camaraderie between the pilots and ground crew remained strong, and their shared determination made every mission a collective effort, one that brought them all a step closer to victory. The relentless effort of the P-47 Thunderbolts had played a crucial role in weakening the German supply lines and crippling their ability to sustain their forces in Italy. As the Allies' ground forces moved northward, the airstrikes coordinated by the Thunderbolts had been instrumental in pushing the Germans into retreat, helping the ground troops advance towards Rome. On June 4th, 1944, when the Allies liberated Rome, the pilots and crews at Alto Air Base could feel the satisfaction of knowing that their efforts had been a significant part of that victory. The Thunderbolt had proven itself not just as a powerful fighter, but as a symbol of resilience, tenacity, and the importance of air support in the success of a ground campaign. As they celebrated their hard-earned victory, the pilots of the 57th Fighter Group and their fellow airmen knew that the P-47 had served them well in more ways than one, both as a capable and dependable aircraft and as a vital contributor to the Allied success. The battle had been long and difficult, but the Thunderbolts had stood strong, providing essential support and leaving a lasting mark on the course of the war.
In 1990, this quiet beach was transformed into a war zone. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, prompting a coalition of countries to combine forces to expel his army. Iraq had over 500,000 frontline troops with another million in reserve, armed with a formidable array of Soviet weapons, including 5,000 tanks. The USAF had an aircraft in their inventory designed specifically to obliterate Soviet armor and provide the much-needed support for the coalition ground forces, the A-10. Curiously, General Horner, commander of air operations, almost left it behind.
General Horner was called in by General Schwarzkopf before the actual assault launched to review what airplanes were going to be there. 1,900 airplanes to be assigned, 0 A-10s. And Schwarzkopf looks at the list and he says, "Where's my A-10s?" And General Horner says, we have We have F-16 specially armed, they'll do the job. Schwarzkopf looks at it, says, I don't want to hear any of your Air Force political bullshit. Give me my A-10s.
The A-10s, aircraft that were at the time 20 years old, managed to outshine the 1,900 aircraft that had been chosen ahead of them, destroying 4,000 tactical targets, a tally higher than all the others combined. With such an impressive performance, why was the USAF so reluctant to bring the Warthog to war? What was it about this tank-busting machine that repulsed them so much? To understand the mystery of the A-10, we have to look back to the origins of the USAF. In World War I and II, the Air Force had been a branch of the U.S. Army. Over time, the role of the Air Force evolved with improved technology and battlefield experience. Aircraft could provide vital aerial intelligence, drop bombs on strategic targets, and move troops and equipment. One of the Air Force's most important jobs was providing close support for troops on the ground. That is, working closely with soldiers on the battlefield and executing the difficult mission of destroying enemy forces without causing casualties to nearby friendlies. As important as this mission was to the overall success of military campaigns, it was despised by many Air Force generals of the day.
From the day one, the United States Air Force, going all the way back to the Army Air Corps, there has been this antipathy to the mission called close air support because it is tied to the Army or ground warfare. And it was a mission that did not fit their view of them being able to independently carry out whatever war that they wanted to and not be tied to what was going on the ground, not be tied to another service.
They very early on decided that what they needed to do to get a decent budget was to emphasize that bombing could win wars. That idea, a very false notion, by the way, still runs the Air Force today. They thought they could get much more money if they built bigger and fancier airplanes like bombers, and if they put out a tremendous amount of propaganda that bombers by themselves could win wars.
As much as the Air Force resented and resisted the close support mission, it was a necessary evil. Time and again, bombing alone proved ineffective at breaking the will of the people, whether it was Germany's blitz of Britain or endless bombing raids of the Allies against German targets. Allied ground forces supported by aircraft had the dirty job of taking back Europe mile by mile. Soldiers often found themselves mired in the quicksand of war, the situation shifting from minute to minute. They needed pilots tuned into the chaos of battle.
Infantry working outside the wire on a patrol, they want something above them that can see all, communicate with them, help them with their navigation problems, help them see ahead, and so they won't be surprised. And if they do get surprised and they come in contact, they can get almost immediate fire on the target. By immediate, I mean within a minute.
As much as the Air Force wanted to focus on bombing missions, they still managed to produce some legendary close support aircraft, albeit by blind luck.
The P-47, which was the original Thunderbolt, that airplane turned out to be a close support airplane totally by accident, which is typical of the Air Force. Since the Air Force didn't care to do close support, obviously they weren't going to design airplanes for it. They designed the P-47 as their approach to the greatest thing in the sky, to shoot down Messerschmitts. In fact, it was not the greatest thing in the sky to shoot down Messerschmitts. It racked up a very good combat record in air-to-air combat because it had some, fabulously good pilots, which count far more than airplanes. By pure accident, it turned out it was a wonderful close support machine because it had a huge radial cast iron engine right in front of the pilot, which was like built-in armor for him from the front. could carry a big load because it was a big airplane, too big to be a good air-to-air fighter. And the engine was very survivable because it didn't have a liquid-cooled engine and radiator. So basically, rifle bullets couldn't bring it down very easily. The P-47 could come home with, 20 or 30 holes in it. And so it racked up a terrific record.
Close support was not considered the most glamorous job, but it was a vital one. The pilots of the 365th Fighter Group, also known as the Hellhawks, flew their P-47 Thunderbolts in one of the most important operations of the war.
It was realized in the Allied headquarters that they needed a tactical air force to support the ground troops directly during the process of the invasion of Normandy. So they needed a dedicated fleet of aircraft, both bombers, transport, and fighters, to seize control of the air and then support the ground troops. So the Hellhawks got drafted, probably not by choice, into that role. They dreamed of themselves as the high-flying pilots with a scarf streaming behind their neck, but they began to realize that they could play a crucial role on the battlefield, and they became very connected emotionally with the GIs on the ground and helping them out.
The Thunderbolt's impact would last long after World War II. The aircraft's success would set the mold for all future close support missions.
The importance of the P-47 and the Hellhawks and the way they use that airplane in combat is still with us today, 65 years later. Since World War II, with a few exceptions in Korea in the early days of that war, American ground troops have never fought without air superiority, without complete confidence that any aircraft they saw overhead was a friendly one. And that's a legacy of the P-47's ability to control the battlefield immediately over the front lines, where the fighting was heaviest.
As the war came to the close, a new weapon emerged which changed warfare forever. The dropping of atomic bombs sealed the fate of Japan in World War II. It also seemed to solidify the position of bomber generals who believed that bombing could win wars alone. The U.S. Air Force was in a powerful position, as it was the only service capable of delivering a bomb, albeit one constructed with the Navy's oversight. Though the Army and Navy were not enthused about sharing their budgets with a young competitor, and slowed and sabotaged the process wherever they could not stop the inevitable, and on September 18, 1947, an independent United States Air Force was born. Though the Army and Air Force were separate entities, the Army relied on aircraft to operate, to transport troops and equipment, and for the vital mission of close support. In 1947, a document was hammered out between the armed services to divide up the roles and missions of their respective fleets of aircraft.
The Army and the Air Force had negotiated a set of unbelievably bad agreements. I mean, bad for the taxpayer and bad for the soldier, called the Key West Agreements, by which they agreed to divvy up air assets. The Army would be in control of all helicopters, and the Air Force would be in control of all fixed-wing airplanes. And the deal was that the Air Force would not object to the Army getting very large numbers of these, would not object to them, doing armed versions of them, and in return the Air Force promised, we'll give you lots of close support.
A young colonel, Avery Kay, took part in these negotiations. He was a highly decorated and respected officer, having navigated the lead B-17 in the Schweinfurt raids, a treacherous mission to cripple Germany's industrial might. Colonel Kay soon realized that navigating through the politics stemming from the inter-service rivalries was no easier.
He was probably one of the most ethical officers I've ever known, a guy of enormous character and courage, almost to the extent of naivete, of being just naive about what bureaucratic chicanery is all about. He came to realize within a year or two after having served in these negotiations and written some of this language where the Air Force promised to deliver close support, he realized the Air Force had no intention of ever delivering that support. And out of conscience, he felt personally responsible and guilty that the Air Force had not delivered and that he had personally participated in the lie. And he dedicated the rest of his career to creating a close support airplane that would deliver on the promises that he had been part of.
In just a few years, The USAF's short-sightedness when it came to close support became blatantly obvious. The Korean War was not decided with an atomic bomb blast. It was a grueling conventional war. Here, the USAF pinned their hopes on their speedy new jet fighters. They may have been state-of-the-art, but they were too fast and without the range to be effective close-support aircraft. P-51 Mustangs left over from World War II were taken out of storage and shipped over as a makeshift solution. But these aging aircraft suffered heavy losses as their engines were vulnerable to ground fire. The Navy and Marines, with their A-1 Sky Raiders and F-4U Corsairs respectively, took the lion's share of the close support work, and they did so brilliantly.
Close support was of the essence, particularly when troops were moving, when we were moving forward, or when the Chinese were pouring over the border and driving us back. The A-1 was in fact a wonderful workhorse, shared the virtues of the P-47, had a big rotary engine up front to protect the pilot, was very hard to shoot down, you could put lots of holes in it, and because it had been designed to pull really big loads off carriers, had a very big wing, which allowed it to maneuver very well at low speed. That airplane did brilliant work, particularly in the hands of the Navy squadrons that had it.
The USAF seemed blind to the lessons learned in Korea and oblivious to the idea that there might be another conventional war. In the years that followed, they continued to focus on building nuclear-armed bombers and jets in preparation for an atomic war with the Soviets. The Army realized that they might have to take the close support mission into their own hands. Chuck Myers recalls Army tests he participated in at Fort Rucker.
A lot of guys in the Army, particularly on the aviation side, felt that the Navy and the Air Force were not going to provide them what they needed, which they referred to as organic air support. The only option they had was somehow try to figure out how to do it with helicopters. And that's what was going on at Fort Rucker, was experimenting with helicopters. They were reinventing our old Army Air Corps. My primary helicopter that I was using was a H-13. They had strapped 30 caliber machine guns to the rails.
When hostilities boiled over in a tiny country in Southeast Asia, the USAF once again found themselves unprepared.
Well, what happened in Vietnam is we went into Vietnam in the Air Force, in particular with aircraft that were not suitable for the situations that we encountered.
In the skies, the USAF needed agile dogfighters capable of keeping up with Soviet-made MiGs. Instead, they had aircraft built to drop atomic bombs and fighters that lacked the basic cannon for shooting down opponents at close range. In terms of close support, they were just as ill-equipped as they had been for the Korean campaign. The USAF were forced to use ancient Navy A-1 Sky Raiders to take up the slack.
In Vietnam, the great hero of the war was the A-1 again. And the A-1 by that time had been sent to the boneyard. The Navy didn't want to hear about it. And somebody in Special Forces had the sense to see, we need that airplane, and convinced Secretary McNamara to bring A-1s back out of the boneyard, refurbish them.
Not surprisingly, the Air Force were less than enthusiastic about having the Sky Raider jammed down their throat by McNamara.
There was nothing that was more hated in the Air Force than to pull out a Navy airplane that had reciprocating engines, no jet, cruised at about 140 miles an hour, right? I mean, this was like anathema to the Air Force.
Though the Sky Raiders were an unwelcome gift from the Navy, they proved themselves again, just as they had in Korea.
The A-1 was a very fine bombing platform, and we could get close to the target and be far more accurate than they could with an F-100 who had to go up, drop his bombs, and get back home quickly before he ran out of fuel.
It saved probably several hundred CIA camps in the jungle that were being overrun, at night by VC and some North Vietnamese regulars.
It would take ultimate damage. Bernie Fisher, who landed during the Battle of Ashaw and picked up a lad who had crashed just off the runway. He had I forget what, 20 or 30 bullet holes through that thing.
While the USAF was trudging forward in Vietnam with the Skyraider, Colonel K, an advocate for close support aircraft, found himself in a new office with a clandestine mission.
Colonel Avery K. He wound up in 1966 in an office, a staff office to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the Pentagon headquarters called Concepts and Doctrine. Concepts and Doctrine was a smokescreen. What it really was about was a term of art in the military called roles and missions. What roles and missions means is your job is to defend the Air Force budget against raids by the Army and by the Navy.
At the time, the U.S. Army was in development of a costly new helicopter called the Cheyenne. It was built for the mission that the USAF detested, close support. 50% more than the Air Force's most expensive fighter, the F-4, K recognized that the Cheyenne was a threat to the Air Force's budget. He also saw an opportunity to leverage the situation to fulfill the Air Force's old promise to the Army.
He realized, if the Army does this, if the Army builds this super expensive $4.5 million helicopter, they're going to want 1,000 of them at least. Where's the money going to come from? It's going to come out of the Air Force budget. Perfectly correct perception. He also perceived that this would be a powerful incentive for the Chief of Staff to develop a close support airplane to make sure that the Army didn't get all that money.
K's plan of creating a close support aircraft to thwart the Cheyenne filtered its way up to the Chief of Staff of the time, John P. McConnell. Though McConnell was a bomber general and loathed the close support mission, he had fears about relinquishing it to the Army.
If you let the Army get away with that Cheyenne helicopter, that costs 50% more than our most expensive fighter, that money's going to come out of your hide, and you're going to go down in history as the Chief of Staff who gave up the close support mission. Of course, no Chief of Staff wants to do that. They're all very worried about their legacy. March on, start developing a close support airplane, make sure it's cheaper than the Cheyenne, and make sure it's much more lethal and much more survivable, so that we have a real case that the money should go to our airplane.
Given the green light to create the USAF's first purpose-built close support plane, Colonel K had to build the brain trust that would help shape the aircraft's specifications. At the time, Pierre Sprey was working for Secretary of Defense McNamara, analyzing the USAF's aircraft inventory in Europe.
I've been assigned to do, are we wasting our money on airplanes in Europe? Are we doing the right thing? Are we buying the right fighters to stop 90 or 100 divisions of Soviets from sweeping over Europe? That was the number one threat in the U.S. military strategy at that point. My conclusion was, we are wasting our money. We need to stop buying so many bombing airplanes. At that time it was called interdiction. We need to focus on close support, on actually helping our defending tank troops and anti-armor and so on with airplanes that can do the job right at the point of battle. That made me public enemy number one of the Air Force instantly.
Realizing he had found a like-minded maverick in Pierre Sprey, Colonel K approached him about joining his team.
He says, Mr. Sprey, I've read your paper. I see that you're a big supporter of close support and you think we should be spending lots more money on it. I've been assigned through my boss, and the Chief of Staff has approved, that we start a great close support airplane. He says, I'm stuck because the entire Air Force is sabotaging me, because the rest of them don't want to do it, just the Chief of Staff. And we badly need help. We have no real technical people. Will you help us? There was no way in conscience that I could turn him down. It was such an absolutely correct thing to do and so badly needed. I said, I'll help you in any way I can.
To help Sprey and Colonel K develop the ultimate close support aircraft, they enlisted the help of A-1 pilots fresh out of Vietnam. Their first-hand experience working with the Army would prove invaluable in creating the new aircraft, then simply known as AX. Tom Christie, who helped examine potential contenders for the AX's weaponry, recalls the passion of K's group.
And so I can remember coming up to Washington, TDY, from Eglin Air Force Base, which I did quite often, and meeting with Pierre Sprey, 8 or 9 o'clock at night in the Pentagon, and I'd show up and he'd have 5 or 6 Air Force officers, that were part of this cabal. And the one in particular that I remember was a guy by the name of AVK, and they wanted to make sure that the Air Force did not go wandering off and make the same mistakes they'd made in previous years. They wanted an aircraft that was dedicated to and designed for close air support.
The interesting thing is, you would have imagined that an airplane born in this kind of sin, designed to simply kill an Army helicopter, couldn't possibly become a good airplane. But the interesting thing is, for us down in the trenches trying to shape this airplane, once we had the Chief of Staff's approval, is these were absolutely ideal circumstances for creating a really good airplane at very low cost. I mean, normally you're told include this technology, you got to include that radar, you got to include this piece of junk, make sure it's plenty expensive so that the contractors get lots of money. Whatever you do, don't make it cheaper than the last airplane. That's what really shapes airplanes today. We have the dead opposite, because our instructions were make the airplane much more lethal, much more obviously lethal than the Cheyenne helicopter, make it much cheaper, and make it much more survivable. That's exactly what you want to do for a close support airplane. So out of the political mayhem of the Pentagon budget battles, we actually had marching instructions that, the designers would kill for.
Pierre Sprey, Tom Christie, and Chuck Myers all pushed for the development of America's first close support plane. In the 1970s, these renegades would bond into a group known as the Fighter Mafia. Together with other like-minded officers and defense analysts, they battled against the establishment to help create the best aircraft to meet the demands of war within the restraints of the government's purse. Though they had their critics, more often than not, the Fighter Mafia were proven to be right. Sprey worked closely with contractors, including Northrop and Fairchild, and reviewed hundreds of designs in the quest to make the ultimate close support plane. But what exactly are the ingredients of such an aircraft?
The primary things you have to be able to maneuver very well at low speed, and that's both to get close to the target so you can distinguish friends from enemies, you can pick up things that the ground guys can't see, and very important, particularly since some of this focus was on Europe, you have to be able to fly under weather. When you've got clouds at 1,000 feet, 500-knot jets become hopeless. You have clouds at 1,000 feet and you have hills that are 500 feet high, and you try to come booming down through those clouds at 500 knots. That's simply not feasible.
The aircraft also needed to be capable of loitering over targets for extended periods, at least 2 and hopefully 4 hours with a full bomb load, 250 miles from base. If a plane had to leave the battle to refuel after just a few short minutes, it wouldn't be around long enough to provide any real support. The A-1 pilots were adamant about this, and about the need for an excellent radio communication system.
You had to have great communications. This was in a day, and by the way, that day extends to today, when essentially no Air Force airplane could talk to the ground. They had radios that deliberately could only talk to other Air Force airplanes or to headquarters or to Air Force radar airplanes, and no direct way to talk to a guy, holding a small tactical radio sitting in a foxhole. My A-1 guys were so insistent on that, they just pounded it into me every day. You can give up anything else, don't give up those radios. That's how important they were.
Another key element of close support aircraft is survivability. Pilots going on such a treacherous mission, close to enemy fire, need to have a reasonable chance of coming back in one piece.
You can't ask pilots to go into an environment this dangerous to airplanes if you can't guarantee them that they're going to, for the most part, get home. And so we put a huge amount of work into survivability.
There was so much attention paid to the aircraft being able to survive in what was forecast to be a very critical environment that we were going to be flying in, with a lot of air defenses. In particular, the 23 millimeter gun system that the Soviets allegedly were fielding in great numbers.
You know, you put a 22 rifle into any modern jet, a 22 rifle bullet into any modern jet, and it will penetrate the tank, will very likely create a leak or light a fire, and the leak itself will catch on fire if it's right next to the engine.
Well, a lot of attention, unprecedented attention, was paid to that whole concept of reducing the vulnerable areas. Being given a hit, will you go down or not?
A plethora of survivability specifications were laid out for the AX. Using cables rather than flammable hydraulics to control the flaps and other control surfaces, and building the structure of the aircraft the old-fashioned way, with spars covered by skin, a feature that allowed the old A-1s to return home with gaping holes in their wings. But perhaps the greatest feature of the AX was, of all things, a titanium bathtub.
We demanded armor, essentially completely around the pilot, certainly up to this level, from the front, the back, and everywhere, that would stop an American .50 caliber bullet or the Russian equivalent. And that led to a 2,000-pound titanium bathtub. They still call it the bathtub to this day, and the pilots love it because it gives them all kinds of confidence when they're pressing an attack and they're hearing impacts of bullets on the airplane and so on.
As important as survivability was, the AX was an offensive weapon, built to destroy tanks. The whole of the aircraft was designed around a massive gun capable of blowing away the competition. While designing the gun specs, Spray looked for inspiration from a most unusual source, a hero of Nazi Germany. In the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force had a helicopter in their crosshairs. Surprisingly, it did not belong to one of its opponents behind the Iron Curtain, but rather the U.S. Army. The costly Cheyenne helicopter, built by the Army to support its troops, was seen as a potential drain on the Air Force's own projects. To counter this rotorcraft, the Air Force began drawing up the specifications for a new close support plane known as the AX. It was an aircraft and mission the Air Force really didn't want. However, the team at the Pentagon behind the AX saw things differently. They saw supporting troops on the ground as one of the most important missions, and they set about to build what would become one of the Air Force's most lethal weapons. The AX was an offensive weapon, built to destroy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and soldiers entrenched in foxholes or behind sandbags. The whole of the aircraft was to be designed around a massive gun capable of blowing away the competition. While designing the gun specs, defense analyst Pierre Spray looked for an inspiration from a most unusual source, a hero of Nazi Germany.
Because I was adamant that we had to do this purely from the point of view of the effectiveness demanded by combat experience, I assigned everybody on the team to read a book called Stuka Pilot by Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, because I had found nothing in the entire literature on close support that gave a more precise and more objective view of what close support is really about.
Rudel flew an incredible 2,500 missions where he rained havoc on opposing armies, destroying an astonishing number of enemy vehicles, including 519 tanks. His tank-busting aircraft of choice was a specially modified Stuka, armed with two 37mm cannons. Spray began a worldwide search for a caliber of bullet powerful enough to pierce Soviet tank armor, while not so large as to make it unwieldy for an aircraft to fire. He found the perfect bullet in the land of fine chocolate and watches, Switzerland. Munitions manufacturer Oerlikon produced a devastating 30mm round, which penetrated with Swiss watch-like precision. Now that Spray had found his bullet, he had to figure out a way to fit 1,000 rounds worth on the AX. The massive amount of ammo was housed in a drum 3/4 the size of a Volkswagen.
Of course, when we started sizing the weapon, see how big it was, a huge ammunition storage, because we wanted enough ammunition for 20 repeated passes. See, that was part of the long loiter, long endurance. It's not just hanging around, you also have to hang around and be dangerous, have weapons.
Carrying so much ammo in such a powerful weapon, the AX might be best described as a flying piece of artillery. Though the 30mm shells were potent and capable of penetrating the thick Soviet armor, they wouldn't necessarily stop a tank in its tracks. At that time, a new type of bullet was in development which packed a depleted uranium punch.
Depleted uranium has exactly the same properties as magnesium. When you hit with a high velocity, you actually light off the metal. The metal burns inextinguishably, just like magnesium does in a flare. This thing is so incendiary that if you just have grease, the normal grease that's in the sump under the engine, you're very likely to light the tank on fire because there's burning fragments everywhere once you've penetrated.
By 1970, Spray and his team had put together all the specifications for their AX aircraft into a concept formulation package. The tremendous amount of work they did paid off. The USAF, still eager to kill the Cheyenne helicopter, approved the plans, as did Secretary of Defense McNamara and Congress. The U.S. Army with the Cheyenne and the USAF with the AX weren't the only ones fighting for a piece of the government spending pie. The Marines had a futuristic close-support aircraft of their own, the AV-8 Harrier. Chuck Myers took part in an evaluation of the three designs.
The group leader turned to me and said, well, we need a plan. Who are we going to visit? Who are we going to talk to about this subject? And I said, well, I think we probably ought to start with the Marine Corps because they probably know more about the subject than anybody else. They have great interest in air support. I set up the meetings for them over at Marine Corps headquarters, and our little group went over there. And we spent a whole morning listening to Marine Corps expound on the subject. And of course, they were pushing this thing called a Harrier, which, if I could think of an airplane least appropriate for close air support, that would be it, because of its vulnerability to small arms fire.
Myers soon realized the bomber generals in the USAF weren't the only ones who had antipathy for the close support mission.
We all convened for lunch, and it broke up into little groups. And I remember sitting at a round table having lunch with a couple of Marines, and one of them was a colonel. And I never forget the colonel saying, he thumped the table and said, boy, we can hardly wait to get our F-14s. And the other guys in my group looked at me like, they're F-14s. They were no more interested in close air support. All they could think of was they were going to get the F-14 along with the Navy. Everybody wants to fly fighters. Nobody really wants to do this horseshit mission down there in the dirt.
While Congress evaluated the aircraft available for the close support mission, Spray's paper airplanes were turned into prototypes. When it came to testing, Spray once again carved his own path.
I had felt very strongly all along that the right way to do this was to get prototypes built, 2 or 3 prototypes by each company, and have a real firing shoot-off, a competition, a fly-off.
The 8-9, A-10 were the 2 entries into the AX program, which was our first foray into a fly-off. That was a different approach. The 4 aircraft, 2 from each company, were flown over a period of many months at Edwards Air Force Base.
That had never been done in the Air Force before. They built lots of prototypes, and people were very reminiscent and very nostalgic about how great it was when we built them, but they never flew against each other. They were kind of engineering models. They went to Edwards Air Force Base. The test pilots flew them, clocked how fast they flew, how long, how high, how fast, and then kind of on paper compared them to other airplanes. We didn't want that. We wanted a real competition where you went and did the mission as realistically as you could with 2 manufacturers fighting it out, and the guy who did the mission best would win.
Northrop and Fairchild Republic were given a little over a year to construct 3 prototypes each, 2 flying and 1 in pieces just for test fire experiments. The possibility of being struck by ground fire was a reality of the close support mission, something not factored into the designs of most jets of the era, which made them vulnerable to attack. Spray challenged aircraft manufacturers Northrop and Fairchild to design planes which kept the volatile fuel supply and the hot-burning engines as far away from each other as possible. While Northrop buried the engines next to the fuselage, Fairchild came up with their own innovative solution.
Fairchild came up with a superb solution. They have the engines out on pylons away from the fuselage. There's no fuel between the engines. All the fuel is way forward in the wings, and it's brought a lot of pilots home. There would have been in airplanes that were burning and crashing.
Spray once again rattled the establishment, this time with his choice of test pilots.
We had the shoot-off at Edwards Air Force Base. Half the pilots were test pilots. This was another huge battle. Half of them were fighter pilots, real pilots, which was crucial because we were going to do so much bombing and strafing. That's not something that test pilots, are particularly adept at. So that was another revolution, another bureaucratic mess, because, of course, the test pilot community has their own little sacred cows.
So these 2 airplanes were flown first by company pilots and then turned over to a team from the Air Force to go through a whole procedure in flight and in other logistics analyses, the whole roll of wax.
It was an extremely close competition between Northrop's A-9 and Fairchild's A-10. It was hard to choose a winner before counting up all the bullet holes and tallying up the scores on each test.
I had thought that Northrop was going to win because they had a somewhat slicker design, a little better aerodynamics. And lo and behold, after all the shooting was done and all the testing, Fairchild had taken the survivability a little more seriously, had an edge there, had a slight edge on some of the accuracy, dive bombing accuracy stuff, and they were awarded the contract. It's exactly what's supposed to happen. The guy you didn't think was going to win won because he did a little better. It was pretty close, though. It was a really tight race. We wouldn't have been badly served by either airplane.
The A-10 Thunderbolt II was named after another legendary close support aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The A-10 was an excellent design, but Fairchild still had to work out some serious technical issues.
We were doing all the follow-on tests on the A-10, primarily gunfire. Because when you were firing guns, the engines would quit. And when the engine would quit, it would be very quiet. I mean, you didn't hear, it wasn't like a compressor stall where it makes a lot of noise. It would just, the temperatures would go up on the engines and ruin them, or the RPM would come down. So I flew thousands and thousands of rounds at the ground to try to solve this engine problem. The problem with the A-10 with the engines were twofold. One, with the gun gas going in the engines and causing the engine to quit. The other one was pulling high angle of attack or high turn rates, because the airplane had good handling quality, so nothing bad happened aerodynamically. But the engines couldn't stand the lack of the air. So the solution to both problems was to put continuous ignition on the trigger. So anytime you fired that, the continuous ignition came on to both engines. So if it quit, it restarted immediately. And also high angle of attack, an angle of attack. So ignition comes on at high angle of attack. The engines keep running. Well, they don't keep running. The pilot doesn't know the difference.
With the A-10 selected for production, the Air Force found itself in an unpleasant situation. Their motive for supporting the A-10 was always to kill the Army's Cheyenne. In 1972, that became a reality. With the Cheyenne dead, they suddenly had a new close support plane in their hands, an aircraft they really didn't want for a mission they despised.
1972, the Cheyenne was safely dead. It had been killed. The Air Force had accomplished its mission, and now started an unending series of assaults to kill the A-10. There wasn't a month that went by that some general didn't have some idea about how to kill the A-10.
The Air Force felt the A-10 was primarily supporting the Army, and they really didn't want that mission. In fact, at one point in time, they were talking about to give them the A-10s to the Army. But then the Air Force decided that was their mission is to fly airplanes and not the Army's mission. So that got to be a controversial thing. The Air Force said, okay, we'll support the Army.
Air Force generals got together with an airplane manufacturer in Texas, Ling Technical Vought, the old Chance Vought company that had been building A-7s for Vietnam. A pretty poor bombing airplane, highly vulnerable, full of flammable hydraulics and all that. And they claimed that they had a model. They would do close support superbly. They got some congressmen to back them, along with these Air Force generals. And they actually forced us to do a fly-off of the A-7 against the then still in development A-10. So we dragged out the YA-10, the prototype, and had a little fly-off. The A-7 was so laughably worse that nobody could pretend that this was a good excuse for killing the A-10.
The A-10 seemed to be equally resistant to battle damage as it was from assaults from the Air Force. Production continued, and in March of 1976, the 355th Tactical Training Wing, based at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona, became the first unit to receive the A-10 Thunderbolt II. This did not dissuade the Air Force from continuing to do all it could to whittle production numbers.
Interestingly enough, the Reagan administration comes in, and as I recall, the A-10, we had a procurement goal of 733 airplanes, something like that total. We had one more year to go. And the Reagan administration rolls in and, of course, throws money at everything the services wanted. And then Stockman, recall Mr. Stockman, who was OMB at the time, sort of said, my God, we need to take a look at all this money we're spending. You know, we're going in the whole tax cuts and all that. So he took aim on the defense budget.
Stockman, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, battled with Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger over Reagan's bloated defense budget. A compromise was reached, which would leave A-10 production in the crosshairs.
Weinberger came back and said, hey, we got to show that we're stewards of the budget, so we need to cut some things. Lo and behold, what does the Air Force offer up? The last year of A-10 production, I think it was a smaller number. We had been up to, I think, 144 aircraft a year. And they also tried to cancel the ammo procurement. Unbelievable. They didn't get away with that.
It wasn't just the Air Force brass who had misgivings about the A-10. Pilots of the day would have preferred to be flying the latest supersonic fighters, but it didn't take long for them to come around.
The guys who joined the A-10 community for one reason or another, a lot of them were there as punishment tours because it wasn't a glamorous tour for anybody. But they became committed to the airplane. The more they learned about the airplane, the mission, what it takes to help guys on the ground, how demanding the mission is, because it takes an enormous order of skill. I mean, it takes a whole set of skills air-to-air pilots don't even dream of. It's a totally different world. And they became dedicated to that world. And then, actually, you know, a bunch of wars came along where they could actually exercise those skills and refine them. And what's interesting is they had the same opposition from the Air Force in the wars as we had when we were trying to produce the airplane.
The A-10's first combat mission was the invasion of Panama in 1989, when the U.S. ousted Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. Though the aircraft faced no real resistance, it would soon have an opportunity to prove itself fully. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. There was international condemnation of the event, and the Iraqi dictator was given a hard deadline of January 15, 1991 to withdraw his army. Coalition forces built an impressive armada of weapons to push Hussein out of Kuwait, including 1,900 aircraft. Curiously, General Horner, commander of air operations, almost left the A-10 behind.
General Horner was called in by General Schwarzkopf. It was before the actual assault launched, and Schwarzkopf looks at the list and he says, "Where's my A-10s?" And General Horner says, we have F-16s specially armed. They'll do the job." Schwarzkopf looks at it, says, "I don't want to hear any of your Air Force political bullshit. Give me my A-10s."
General Schwarzkopf recognized the abilities of the A-10 as a tank buster in close support planes. It had been built to destroy Soviet tanks, and the Iraqis had more than 5,000 of them. He made a wise choice. The A-10 destroyed more tactical targets than all other aircraft combined. Even General Horner could not deny the A-10's excellence, at least temporarily.
The A-10s did such a good job of bailing out the failures of other airplanes that the same General Horner, who had refused to deliver A-10s at the beginning of the war, said, right in the middle of his staff in the famous black hole bunker in Saudi Arabia that was commanding the whole air war, after he saw the results of the A-10s, particularly even in wiping out missile sites, mind you, which they'd never been intended to do. He said, I take back every bad thing I said about the A-10. They saved our asses. And that was heard by a whole bunch of staff members, has been widely quoted since then. Now, here's the interesting thing. After the war, when everything had died down, people had done the battle damage assessment, and by the way, the Air Force had totally suppressed the successes of the A-10 that I just quoted, and had put out a whole bunch of junk about how brilliantly the F-117 did and all this. This is all hogwash. General Horner was forced by his fellow generals to renege on what he had said and joined the assaults on the A-10. You know, actually went back on what he had said about how they saved our asses. He said, no, they weren't that important. Now you ask yourself, how could a guy who had spent his career, you know, flying airplanes, he'd flown a lot of fighters, he wasn't just a bomber guy. But once he got to be a general, he was so infected by the culture around him of the other general officers. And that culture, dating again back to the 1920s, was a bomber culture. It's, you know, we bomb targets that we assign to our Air Force. We do it independently of the Army. We do it with airplanes that are very expensive because they're good for getting us a bigger budget. And that's what the Air Force is about.
Though the A-10 had done excellent work against Iraqi forces, by the end of the first Gulf War, the Air Force should have had a replacement in the pipeline. Aircraft have long gestation periods, and the A-10 was based on 1970s technology. But the bomber culture that permeated the upper echelons of the Air Force made a new aircraft nearly impossible.
A lot of the people in the close support community, the military reform community, in 1983 started proposing developing a far better, far more modern A-10. You know, we called it variously the Mud Fighter or the Blitz Fighter. And it was going to be smaller, hotter, much better maneuverability, better able to get close in, better able to survive, have even more lethal weapons than the A-10, and we were ambitious to make it even cheaper than the A-10. And we had designs laid out, and we briefed them all over the Pentagon, and the Air Force came down like one man to kill it.
The Air Force went bonkers. When they found out that Lockheed at Marietta, there were people down there doing some work on that, they told Lockheed, either you back off this and stop all this, or you don't have a prayer's chance of competing with what was coming down the road, which was the Advanced Tactical Fighter, which became the F-22. So they stopped.
To put the final nail in this new aircraft's coffin, the Air Force offered a compromise of sorts.
An Air Force two-star came down and said, okay, we want to sign a peace treaty. You guys back off pushing this new aircraft, okay? You do that, and we promise we will back off retiring A-10s. Not only that, we will upgrade them. So we agreed. So they did. They took away the planned retirement, so which was to start probably in 1990-91.
Without a replacement, close support pilots were forced to soldier on with aging A-10s. Now the Air Force had a new excuse to rid themselves of the A-10. It was too old.
Nothing changes about these assaults. The first one is always the airplane is so old, you know, it's aging, it's decrepit, it's going to cost a lot to maintain. It's a perfectly silly argument. First of all, the A-10 is not the only old airplane in the Air Force. The Air Force generals are defending a far older airplane, the B-52. It's okay, we've so refurbished and remodernized it, even if it is older than all the pilots, who cares? Well, oddly enough, the same thing is true of the A-10. The A-10 has been heavily refurbished. In fact, it's an amazingly modern airplane now. First of all, most of the fleet has been re-winged, although the Air Force is now trying to steal that money for the F-35, the re-winging money. But most of them have already been re-winged and will be good to 2040. You know, secondly, it's completely false that older airplanes get more expensive to maintain. The older airplanes, B-52 included, are vastly cheaper to maintain than any of the new airplanes that replace them. And they're just like old cars. If you find somebody to make the parts, you can keep a car going forever, and people who love the car do.
As the airplane stands today, there's nothing that can touch it in terms of performing this mission. There's just no way. It can do all the things that the ultra high-tech systems can, like F-15s and F-18s and so on. It can do all those things just as well as they can, but it can work the other end of the spectrum down low. In lack of anything else, I would open the line and build more A-10s.
From the invasion of Iraq to Afghanistan to the war against ISIS, the Air Force has been equally reluctant to bring the raging warrior to battle with them. Though the A-10s took part in the initial assault on Iraq, they were mothballed from 2003 to 2007. The USAF tried to rely on F-16s and other fighters to hit targets on the ground, but they were often inaccurate and caused casualties amongst friendlies. It wasn't until 2007 that the Air Force was forced to concede they still needed the A-10, an aircraft originally designed for a jungle war.
The A-10 was a Vietnam follow-on because all the airplanes in Vietnam didn't have much fuel to stay around the target area. And of course, Vietnam was over, but it turns out now that the A-10 was perfect for Iraq and Afghanistan because it can loiter for long times. It's got plenty of ammo. That gun is absolutely outstanding as far as the 30 millimeter. You put the pepper on the target and the first dozen bullets go there. You know, no question. That's where they go.
Like the USAF, the Russian Air Force has a dedicated ground support aircraft of their own, the Sukhoi Su-25, an aircraft with an uncanny resemblance to Northrop's A-9. Introduced in 1981, it is still in production, and with multiple upgrades it continues to support Russian troops and the troops of buyers from around the world. The Russian Air Force does not seem to have the same hang-ups about close support as the USAF, and in 2015, the Su-25 was brought into Syria to combat ISIS. Rather than create a new dedicated close support aircraft, the USAF is pinning their hopes in dollars on stealth multi-role fighter, the F-35. This versatile aircraft was designed to handle the missions of not only the A-10, but also the F-16 and F-18 and Aviate for the USAF, Navy, and Marines. Critics of the A-10 label it a single-purpose aircraft, but could a jack-of-all-trades master any of these missions?
Here we are now with the A-10, obviously now 40 years old, 30 to 40 years old, though it's still got life. And we have one program going, F-35, and that's going to fill all these missions. And that's just outrageous to even, think about that.
Multitasking is a huge waste of money because it leads to enormously expensive airplanes. Instead of that $250 million airplane, we could have a great close support airplane for $20 million or $25 million. We could have a great fighter, air-to-air fighter, for $30 or $35 million. And then we could have whatever else you need, a reconnaissance airplane or those other kind of missions that maybe it does. We could have one of those for $30 or $35 million.
It's uncertain when the F-35 will be able to take over for the A-10 and how effective it will be. Though the A-10s have been upgraded into the most advanced close support aircraft in the world, the USAF is almost embarrassed to bring them to front lines as they battle ISIS and prepare for a potential conflict in the Ukraine.
I agree with the Air Force, you know. It is a disgrace that we're flying that ancient airplane, and it's their fault. Because we should have been started, by the mid-'80s, we should have been started prototyping something that was better than the A-10, and then let it prove that it was better. If it wasn't better, then we wouldn't build it. You know, we never did that, because the Air Force never wanted to do that mission.
Over the years, the A-10 has proven itself the premier close support aircraft in the world. Sadly, it has also become a symbol of the strife between the branches of the armed services. The A-10 was authorized by the Air Force as a means to destroy an Army helicopter. Though it ended up doing an exceptional job supporting the Army, from day one it has been under attack from within. The A-10 still has its detractors, but the resilient aircraft is ready to prove itself if given the chance. As each branch fights for its share of the defense budget, perhaps they are blinded to the bigger picture, that they are at war with their enemies, not each other. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its reputation as a rugged workhorse of the United States Army Air Force in World War II, striking down close to 4,000 enemy aircraft on more than 700,000 sorties. The success of this aircraft would solidify the status of Republic Aviation as a leader in aircraft manufacture and design, and ignite the career of its chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli, whose genius helped create the P-47, would shape a generation of ever more advanced aircraft, from the F-84 Thunderjet to the F-105 Thunderchief to the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Dr. Robert Sanator, a protege of Kartveli, was witness to this golden age at Republic as he worked his way up from designer to company president. In an exclusive interview, Dr. Sanator pays homage to the legacy of Alexander Kartveli and the aircraft he conceived for Republic.
My first job at Republic Aviation, 1951, was as a junior engineer, which is an entry position for young engineering graduates.
And what responsibilities did you have?
Very little. Mostly it was working under the supervision of others, and I began my career in the aerodynamics department. Republic was a great place to be. It was staffed with incredibly smart, in fact, brilliant people in all aspects of the running of the business. It was led by strong people who gathered around them the best that was in America. And I learned a lot. I learned everything from the people I worked with over the years. I should say this, that at the time period of when I started there, it was filled with opportunity. It is different than today. There were many aviation companies in existence, and each of them had many projects. When I went to Republic in 1951, there were 6 active aircraft programs in being. So a person had the opportunity to learn a lot about the different airplanes, to participate, and to really do engineering or whatever kind of work you wanted to do. There were many, many opportunities. I worked on every one of those airplanes in the first year that I was there, from the XF-91 to the straight-wing F-84s, to the F-105, to the XF-103, and the swept-wing versions of the F-84. I count them as about 6 programs that were moving simultaneously. There is no such thing that I know of today, and there certainly aren't very many aircraft companies around in the U.S. today. So in my own case, within being there about 6 months, I was asked to, of all things, to go and get some wind tunnel testing done down at what was then NACA, is now NASA in Langley Field, in their 7 by 10 foot tunnel of what became the XF-84H, which was a turboprop F-84. And there were some things that we needed to learn about how to fly that airplane, so to get its aerodynamic characteristics. And I was given that opportunity to work with the NASA or NACA engineers, do the testing, collect all the data, and analyze what kind of flying qualities this machine would have. Major D. Seversky, as many people know, was a Russian. He was a pilot, and he flew combat work in the First World War. He was involved in, I think, an explosion of some kind in the airplane, and lost his leg. Nevertheless, even with his wooden leg, D. Seversky still proved to his superiors that he was a combat pilot. So I think that tells you something about an individual. And so I admired that in him. After the war, he started work with, I think, the SEV-3, which was an amphibian airplane. That was the forerunner of all of the Seversky airplanes that later became Republic airplanes, the P-35, the P-43, and ultimately the Thunderbolt, P-47. Seversky was out of that picture. That was Kartveli. Kartveli started to work with Major D. Seversky sometime in the late 1920s. But of course, the company was formed in 1931, the Seversky, and Alexander Kartveli became the chief engineer and stayed with them. In 1939, the company became Republic Aviation. Major D. Seversky was taken out of his position because of financial problems. And we moved on from there with the different derivatives, those airplanes up to the Thunderbolt, P-47, which was led, that one and many other aircraft, by Alexander Kartveli. What I can tell you about Mr. Kartveli is that he had a very good technical background. So he was a good mathematician, and yet a lot of it was feel. And it is, after all, engineering is an art. It is not a science. It is, at least I was trained in that concept, it is an art. If you stick only to the books and the numbers, you may not succeed. You need to have a feel for things. And he did. But he relied on the best information he could get from his supporting team to use that feel to make it work. Some of the things I remember hearing about from Mr. Kartveli were when the P-47 was put into service, it was clearly much bigger than the kind of aircraft that were flying there, such as Spitfire. But it had certain characteristics that were very good. It had the ability to dive rapidly, to build up to very high speeds, so that if it got onto an enemy's tail and the enemy decided to dive, we would get very far because the P-47 was good at that. At Republic, right after the Second World War, there were a couple of directions that were being laid down. One was trying to continue in the military aircraft field with the straight-wing F-84s. The other side of it was trying to compete in the commercial field. Two aircraft designs were put forward. One called CB, which was an interesting little airplane with a pusher prop and able to operate amphibiously. When I was teenage, there was a radio host named Arthur Godfrey, and he talked about the CB, which got my attention. And so I tried to find out what this was about, and it was designed to be built for the consumer market with the concept that many people would be returning from military flight and might want to these little airplanes. There was a target cost of about $3,500 per airplane, which today would sound to be incredulous. I think if their final price was about $6,000. The other airplane was called XF-12, which later became known as the Rainbow. And this was a beautiful design, a very, very streamlined airplane, 40 to 45 passenger airplane that the company was trying to offer to the Air Force. They then tried to sell it to the airlines, and there were some people who were interested in it. It never got bought. The orders for the that company thought, that Republic thought would be taken by Pan Am, TWA, others like that, did not materialize. So the project was dropped. On the military side, there was a great deal of activity on a whole family of F-84 aircraft, starting from the straight-wing F-84. At the same time, there was a XF-91 that used a lot of the components of the F-84, but put an inverse tapered wing of variable incidence. And the inverse tapered wing was designed in order to avoid what was called a saber dance, which was the F-100 Sabre having some problems with the tip stall. That airplane was one of the first aircraft to go supersonic, or transonic to supersonic at sea level. It was, I think, the first. The airplane never went into production because it did not have the range. At the same time, while these things were going on, the swept-wing F-84s, both the F-84F, the RF-84F, and other F-84 Thunderstreaks and Thunderflash and everything with Thunder was in progress. And while I was doing wind tunnel work on the XF-84H at Langley Field, there were these projects that were moving along. At the same time, the F-105 went into production in the early 1950s. So the time period is, over a period of several years, there were a large number of things that grew out of the Thunderjet. It was amazing to me how from the P-47, the company under the direction of Alexander Kartveli was able to make such a rapid move into jet aircraft. Many projects very quickly after the end of the Second World War. And one thing that Mr. Kartveli always insisted on was low drag, streamlined shapes. It had to be smooth, it had to look good, and his opinions were that if it looked good, it would work well. So they went from the Thunderbolt P-47 to a whole series of aircraft with the prefix Thunder, the XF-103. Now this was a extremely novel concept. It was an interceptor that would fly at speeds in excess of Mach number 3.5. And it was a single place with a chin inlet for hypersonic speeds. And it would take the turbojets that would convert to ramjets at high speed. Now that went to markup stage, and it had very, very thin wings, beautiful looking aircraft. One designer said those wings are meant for shaving because they were so razor sharp, right? And it was basically a Delta platform. And I think at the time it was in competition for the role of interceptor against the 102. But as the years went by, the program was canceled at Republic in 57 or 58, 1957, 1958. And what came out was something called A-11, which became SR-71, the Blackbirds. And so that took the role of the high altitude, high Mach number aircraft that the F-103 was moving towards. And of course, that was a black program. We never knew it existed, or at least I didn't. And it was well understood why the 103 never got legs. But I did wind tunnel work on the 103 in the early 50s, the usual aerodynamic characteristics and such. So that is the breadth and extent of a large number of things that grew out of the Thunder series. The F-105 was, as you guess, was initially started out to be a nuclear weapon carrier. And there was initially, in the early F-105s, a large bomb bay that was built into the airplane to carry what we used to refer to in our engineering language as a special store. A special store was a nuclear-tipped piece of ordnance. It was then determined somewhere along the line that this, of course, we never used it. Hope we never had to. And it was determined that really the F-105 would not be required to do its initial mission, which was carrying the nuclear store internally. So it then got converted into a ground attack airplane. And that large area that was in the bomb bay, which was called by many of our people the ballroom, because it was a big area, got utilized for other equipment. And the airplane went through a whole family of changes, from the initial A's to the B's to the D's to the F's, and ultimately F conversion into G's, the Wild Weasel. And there were a total of 833 F-105s that were built by Republic. Superb design, great airplane. It got a reputation for requiring long runways because of relatively low power. But when the J-75s, particularly the -19 engine, became available, a lot of that disappeared. But it had still the reputation, and so got the moniker of Thud. But the Thud was a great airplane. I told you before about Kartveli's feeling about smoothness, sunless, streamlined shapes, and it was true. things worked, and Republic made some very fast airplanes. And I'll tell you two things. One, during the F-105 program, Richard Whitcomb of NACA had developed what he called transonic area rule. And the F-105 required, in order to satisfy the rule and make it go through the transonic speed zone more easily, what's known as a Coke bottle shape. Well, when Mr. Kartveli heard of that, he would have none of it. But he says, we are not putting Coke bottles on my F-105. But turned out that when he saw the test data, changed his mind and allowed the Coke bottling to take place, although not totally as much as Richard Whitcomb suggested, but enough to do what it had to do. So he was able to step back from his beliefs when the facts proved them. And I think that's very important when you work with people. Your next in line are allowed to be heard, and they're not afraid to be heard, and they know that if they're right, sooner or later, it will come to pass. I think the sad part of Republic's history was that the decision made by Secretary of Defense McNamara to not purchase the next planned set of F-105s, but to use the Navy's F-4. And I think around 63 or 64, around that time, was very unfortunate. It took a great company and put it on its knees. They went then in 1965 to be purchased by Fairchild, and fundamentally were supporting the F-105s in the field and doing subcontract work. And they lost a lot of their people, but they fortunately retained enough to win the A-10 and to give them another chance at that. The TFX competition, which became the F-111, we were in that. We're in that. We didn't win that. Possibly we didn't win that. Don't know why. Maybe the concept was that the F-105 was going to phase out, and then what were we going to do? So there were those years that the company just hung on, and then was successful in getting another chance at the A-10.
I found that like many things in life, the object that wins the competition is not necessarily the best designed or the logical winner. Mm-hmm. There are other aspects of the competition.
Yes.
Political being not the least of them.
Oh yes, and I think if we were to talk about what causes an airplane to succeed with its customers or potential customers as opposed not to, as you point out, there are many reasons, not necessarily which is the best design. And some of those reasons might be the ability or ability of management to actually pull the job off. That's an important assessment factor. And it may well be political. There are all these things that come into it. Our own belief at Republic during the F-15 program, and it's just our opinion. We don't know this to be a fact, but we had been told that we had a very good F-15 proposal for its design work, and I think the competition was running between Republic and General Dynamics. That's my recollection of that. And almost apparently out of nowhere, in the final phases of this, McDonnell Douglas entered. And they had a fine airplane, but so did we. And we believed at the time that the superior strength as perceived by the Air Force or the Pentagon of the McDonnell Douglas Corporation and its ability to manage the program was the reason that they were selected. The 8-9 A-10 were the two entries into the AX program, which was our first foray into a fly-off. Now, prototypes were built for fixed price. I think Republic charged something like $40 million, but used a lot more than that to field two prototype A-10s. And similarly, Northrop fielded two A-9s. The first flight of our A-10 was in 16 months. So from award of contract to the first flight of our first prototype was 16 months, which is what you even could do in 1970 if it's undocumented prototype work, not a lot of paper. So these two airplanes were flown first by company pilots and then turned over to a team from the Air Force to go through a whole procedure in flight and in other logistics analyses, the whole ball of wax, to determine which one would be the winner. That was a different approach than the things that were done in the days of the other Thunder aircraft. The 4 aircraft, 2 from each company, were flown at over a period of many months at Edwards Air Force Base.
Present?
Oh, yes.
And so, was this a nail-biting time?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, tell me about that.
Well, the first nail-biting time is after 16 months when our chief test pilot took the airplane off, right? Sam Nelson was the pilot, and he had done simulator work. I went with Sam to Moffett Field in California, where they had a large mobile simulator where we put the characteristics of our A-10 in there, and he got practice in flying the airplane by a simulator. Well, I took it off, and that was a gear down test. We did not collapse or retract the gear during that test, and seemed to behave the way, at least in those low-speed flights, the way we intended to. So that, I think, is the first nail-biter. Oh, first flights are like that, you know.
Right. Will it fly?
Yeah. And we had an incident as the testing went on. We had 2 prototypes, right? And one of the young captains, fine man, always liked him, he landed one of our prototypes in a controlled crash. In other words, I think that he accepted the blame for judgment, and I think he blew out the tires, right? When you blow out the tires on an airplane, bad things happen, and you do some damage. But we had some really good engineers who went out and fixed that airplane, and it was back in the air in a matter of maybe weeks. See, I know that the young captain that flew it got out of the airplane and threw his helmet on the ground. He was so upset of what happened that put us at a potential disadvantage, you know. But it's kind of people that work for the Air Force, kind of people that we had that let's just go fix it and go on from here. For a while, I was preliminary design manager, and I was responsible for leading our engineers and manufacturing people in design of our airplane. And it's pretty ugly. And Mr. Kartveli the biggest part about it that he really was unhappy was the wing selection in terms of its thickness and camber. And that was selected in order to meet a low-speed maneuvering requirement, a sustained maneuvering requirement at about 150 knots. So Mr. Kartveli, of course, had been working up in high Mach numbers. Speed was everything. So we had many debates, he and I, about thin wing, thick wing, and all that. We never really resolved it. However, when the contract was awarded to the Republic over Northrop, hopefully that means we had a superior airplane in all things considered, and it met the requirements, but it was designed to meet the requirements. He came to me and he said, "Monsieur le Sénateur, you were right." I mean, I will never, ever forget that.
What would you say his legacy is, by any chance? What would you say?
Well, the legacy that Mr. Kartveli would be responsible for is the entire family of aircraft, and it's substantial. Many different kinds of airplanes, developing from the technology of the 20s and the 30s right up until the 70s. And to a historian or someone who visits the museums and looks up the aircraft, his fingerprints are all over them. Republic's airplanes have been used in many different ways. Mr. Kartveli's designs from the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Thunder series right up to Thunderbolt II have a linkage. And the linkage comes from all of the engineering talent that grew in that time period. People that worked on the AX or A-10 for us were there years before and learned about ground attack and close air support and how to design things. So one could see that the Thunderbolt II is generated out of a long history reaching back to the original Thunderbolt. From the aerodynamics work, which I did for 8-9 years, then more project work, working on the aerospace plane, on hypersonic vehicles, the F-15 project, which was our proposal, that was eventually gone to McDonnell Douglas. And of course, I was a principal on the AX competition, which pitted Northrop's A-9 against the Fairchild Republic A-10. And I spent a lot of time first as the chief technical engineer on that A-10 or AX, and then as a deputy program manager when it became a development and production, full-scale development, and went from there to senior vice president of the company dealing with technology and business administration, business development, sorry. And then was fortunate enough to be selected to become president. So that in a nutshell takes care of 35 years of involvement with Republic.
What are you most proud of?
I think the things that stay in my mind, the one thing that stays in my mind is the A-10 program, because that was bringing the company back from the grave. In 1970 dollars, it is a program that brought $5 billion, which is not much these days, but in 1970 it was a lot of money for a program that provided work, opportunity for development, and more chances to succeed. So that is the single most important impact on me and what the most important memories I have. summing up, I would say that the story of Republic Aviation is a great story, and that it covered the waterfront. It was a leader.
She was a former beautician who left the hair business for the air business. She was the first woman to win the Los Angeles to Cleveland Bendix race, and the first person, male or female, to fly the route nonstop. When the Germans invaded Poland, she asked First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to help her get permission to train women to fly combat support. In 1943, she established the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, to ferry aircraft from the United States to the front. After the war, she set a new speed record for propeller-driven craft, and in 1953 became the first woman to break the sound barrier. In 1964, she capped her career by setting one last record, taking the F-104 Starfighter to 1,429 miles an hour. She was Jackie Cochran, and she is a legend of air power. No one knows exactly when Jackie Cochran was born or even where. But in 1906, give or take a year, the woman who would become one of the greatest female aviators of the 20th century was born Bessie Mae Pittman somewhere in Florida. She was raised by foster parents, and though she didn't have shoes until she was 8 years old, she seemed instilled with a belief in her own destiny.
She, in many ways during that time, invented a life for herself. She would spend a lot of time alone. She would spend a lot of time dreaming about what she was going to do.
She learned how to style hair, and by the time she was 16, was something of an expert at the emerging technology of the permanent wave. She moved around a lot, and when time and space didn't put enough distance between her and her upbringing, she picked a new name out of the phone book, Cochran.
When she felt like she had exhausted her potential in Florida, she packed up her bags and went to New York City, where she got a job at a very high-end salon called Antoine's. And it was there that she really began to expand her horizons by meeting a variety of wealthy people, people whose lives were dramatically different than anything she had known before.
She arrived in New York in 1929, just in time for the stock market crash. No matter, it was the big city, and she was part of a world she had barely imagined. And the unemployed in the street did little to dampen her enthusiasm.
She became such a favorite of many of the society ladies that they would ask her to travel with them to Miami when they wintered over. And so she would travel to Miami with them and do their hair down there, and frequently she was invited to dinners and parties.
A real-life Cinderella, Cochran met her prince at one of those parties, Floyd Odlum. A self-made millionaire, Odlum was bored with society chit-chat, and when seated next to Cochran was instantly impressed that her conversation surged past the normal gossip and on to bigger things.
She opened up and told him all her hopes and dreams and ambitions and bubbled over with enthusiasm. Well, this caught Floyd's attention, and he was mesmerized by her. And it wasn't a case where this was an older man looking at a younger woman saying, "Oh, I'm going to make something of you." This was a fellow who said, "Wow, this is a gal that's going somewhere," and decided that he wanted to be a part of that and play a role in it.
He was impressed with her. And what he did when they got married, he helped her out in every endeavor that she wanted to attend, whether it's flying or business or anything like that. And he sort of used Jackie as a hobby.
Unaware of his wealth, she explained her plans of starting a cosmetics company. Odlum listened and suggested that the only way to oversee such a broad enterprise would be to get a pilot's license and fly from place to place. Within a few hours of meeting Jackie Cochran, Floyd Odlum had given her an idea that would change her life and the history of aviation. She learned to fly in 1932 in New York and then went west to learn more. she befriended a group of Navy pilots who taught her the Navy way.
There's no such thing as a natural-born pilot, because all pilots start out with the same level of visual acuity, hand-eye coordination, things like that. And what happened is the guy with the most experience, or gal, is the best. That's him. And she had a lot of experience flying airplanes as a WASP during World War II, ferrying them from the factory to the operational units.
She thought of herself as a slow learner and struggled with basic flight maneuvers. But she persisted, and when she needed help, she didn't hesitate to track down the right person and ask.
I think Jackie had that undefinable something that so many pilots seem to have. And it's a combination of wanderlust and determination and a need for a little bit of glory and to kind of set yourself ahead of the pack. And probably for Jackie, that came as a result of her childhood.
In the 1930s, the place to be for an aviator who wanted to make her mark was in the private sector. The Navy and Army Air Force were starved for funding, flying outdated aircraft, confined to workaday missions like flying mail. But in the private sector, things were different. The 1930s were a time of excitement, of big money air racing and flying circuses. Jackie Cochran was part of that world. She barnstormed around the country, competing in air races and putting on exhibitions, always setting her sights on the next great challenge. She set dozens of world records, in the process befriending the elite of aviation, including Jack Northrop, Amelia Earhart, and Howard Hughes. In 1934, only 2 years after receiving her pilot's license, she became the first woman to compete in the Los Angeles to Cleveland race for the Bendix Trophy. In 1937, she came in third, and in 1938, she won what was then the biggest annual air race in the world. At the same time, she founded and operated Jackie Cochran Cosmetics. With her husband Floyd's help, but always under her own power, she kept tight control of her company.
Now, certainly marrying a millionaire helps you to achieve probably more quickly than the old-fashioned way, but she had already established herself as a go-getter. And indeed, what attracted Floyd Odlum to her was the fact that she was a go-getter.
He sponsored just about everything she wanted to do, and she was her own business lady when she set up Jackie Cochran Cosmetics and was an agent for Nina Ricci perfume, dresses, and things like that from Paris. Floyd let her run her own business, but he would help her, you know, like setting records required a great deal of support, both financially and, you know, business-wise. And so he was involved in them, and he helped her, I'd say, probably a great deal.
She oversaw the lab that developed the products, flew from city to city, selling her line to upscale department stores. When she arrived somewhere, she always took time before getting out of the cockpit to spruce up her makeup. Nominated to the committee that annually awarded the Collier Trophy for the greatest contribution for aviation, she advocated giving the award to medical doctors researching the effects of high-altitude flight. The trophy had always gone to pilots or aircraft designers, but Cochran succeeded in getting scientific research recognized. She then lobbied President Roosevelt, who for the first time committed government money to the research that led to the development of G-suits, pressurized aircraft, and oxygen masks. By 1940, aviation had become a more serious business. The Germans had rearmed and taken Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France. The British were under fire. The head of the British Ferry Command asked Cochran if she would fly a Hudson bomber from Canada to England to draw attention to the company's resupply efforts. She jumped at the chance, and despite sabotage of her aircraft and enemy fire, got safely across the Atlantic. She arrived in time to witness the Blitz and to watch London burn under the Luftwaffe onslaught. She returned to the United States with a plan to develop female pilots to help ferry aircraft, freeing male pilots for combat duty. The British were doing just that, and the program was clearly successful. She met with President Roosevelt, who seemed interested, and appealed to his wife Eleanor for help. She worked her way down the chain of command, always with lukewarm endorsements that gave her hope, if not confidence, that the plan would be adopted. She met with Hap Arnold, who said he'd get back to her, and with General Robert Olds, commander of the American Ferry Command. Olds was himself considering hiring women pilots on a contract basis, but Cochran wanted the pilots to be full members of the military, not just hired civilians. When she pressed her point, Arnold said no, the time for that had not come, but suggested she return to England and study the British experiment in female aviation. A month before Pearl Harbor, Cochran left the United States. She and 25 other American women set out to prove they could do what was, in the United States, a man's job. She was commissioned a flight captain in the British Air Transport Auxiliary and went to work setting up her American Volunteer Corps as the Germans bombed London. They ferried Spitfires and Hurricanes from factory to field, and during their 18 months of flying up to 5 flights a day, only 1 pilot died. In 1942, Arnold came to London and asked Cochran to return to the United States. Desperate for pilots, he asked her to set up the women's command she had advocated. It took her a month to put her British affairs in order and return home. She returned to find that Olds had been doing what she had not been allowed to do.
Well, she hit the roof when she got back and discovered that something had been done in her absence that was not based on her blueprint. So she went to every office in Washington that would open its door and let them know what she thought of it.
She was a very aggressive gal, and basically when she wanted to do something, she did it. You didn't want to get between her and it.
Arnold offered to shut the women's air ferrying service down, but Cochran convinced him to wait. She needed time, she said, to study the situation and figure out the best course of action. In September, she went to work in Arnold's office. Her job was to train as many female pilots as she could, so that those pilots could take over non-combat roles, freeing experienced male pilots for combat duty. Word leaked to the media that the famous Jackie Cochran was setting up a flight school for women. In a matter of weeks, before she had a field, planes, quarters, or trainers, she had 25,000 applicants. In August 1943, she was named director of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. Her embryonic training program merged with the existing Women's Ferry Pilots program, and while not technically a part of the military, it seemed as though Cochran was well on the way to getting women into the Army Air Force. She set up operations in Texas, eventually moving to an abandoned facility near Sweetwater. Before she left, Arnold called General Barton Yount, the commander of the Fort Worth Training Command. "Barton," Arnold shouted into the phone, "Jackie Cochran will be down there in a few days, and I want her to have everything she wants." Jackie Cochran arrived in Texas in late 1943 to start training her female pilots. Almost as soon as word of her program got out, she found herself in a fight for her political life. Several powerful members of Congress didn't think it right that women were training to fly military aircraft. They argued that Cochran's WASPs were taking jobs from men with families to feed. It was an absurd claim in the middle of war-caused labor shortage, but it was a claim that resonated. In a nation still scarred by the Great Depression, members of Congress quickly lined up against Cochran. She also had another, perhaps more surprising adversary, Colonel Ovida Culp Hobby. The commander of the Women's Army Corps, Hobby assumed that if the WASP became part of the military rather than a women's auxiliary, they would come under her command. While Cochran wanted the WASP to be part of the Army Air Force, she would have none of Ovida Culp Hobby as her commander. Part of that was personal animosity. She referred to Hobby as the woman I love to hate. But among flyers at the time was also a general belief that aviation was not well understood by the Army as a whole. It was a given that the Army Air Force would, after the war, spin off into its own service. Why, Cochran reasoned, allow the WASP to be absorbed into the regular Army when they would just be made independent after the war? The result was an uncomfortable compromise. Cochran retained control, but the WASP stayed civilian. Hobby made sure that the WASP remained obviously non-military. They weren't issued uniforms, for example, and when Cochran complained, Hobby saw to it that they got only women's Army Corps coveralls. It was a not-so-subtle hint about who controlled women in the military, and a reminder that the WASPs were mere civilians.
Jackie Cochran was not a mild, meek person. She had a steamroller personality. If she wanted something, she absolutely let everybody know she wanted it and how she expected to get it.
Cochran, of course, was not without resources. She had a WASP uniform designed at the exclusive Bergdorf Goodman department store in New York, and then convinced Arnold to pay to have them mass-produced.
In terms of the WASPs, she was absolutely unwilling to let anybody play a role that was the opposite of what she had envisioned for this group. So she went in and fought her way into a position of authority and then kicked into the training and really conducted the entire organization as a military operation.
Their performance record was magnificent. They shuttled thousands of aircraft around the country, freeing hundreds of male pilots for combat duty. They handled the most difficult planes, demonstrating that women could fly temperamental, physically demanding aircraft, and compiled accident records that compared favorably with men's. She believed wholeheartedly that she was making progress, and in December 1944, Congress gave her her reward. They ordered the WASP disbanded. The women, Congress decided, should go back to their place. Not only would the WASP not be absorbed into the military, they would not be allowed to continue flying as they already had, no matter how successful they had been. The more than 1,000 pilots the WASPs had trained in less than a year were given their walking papers.
I was at the, I think, 25th anniversary of the disbandment of the WASP, which occurred in 1944, and this is later. I'm up at Edward, so I came down. She said, would you come down and give a talk to the WASP about current, kind of flying in airplanes and technology? So I did, and I met probably there's about 400 of them down there, and they were really, really classy gals. I'd never met too many of them. But see, there were so few of them that were able to continue flying after they were disbanded, that very probably not over a half a dozen that I knew that kept on flying. Jackie was one of them.
Jackie served out the remainder of the war as a consultant to Hap Arnold. Working as a magazine correspondent, she was the first American woman to enter Japan after the end of the war. At the end of 1945, the president signed an order awarding her the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest honor. The president, she was told, was looking forward to pinning the award on her. She said in response that the only person she'd accept it from would be Hap Arnold. If he couldn't do it, they could mail it to her. You don't refuse the president, Arnold told her aghast. Well, I did, Cochran answered. And in a Pentagon conference room, Arnold gave her the medal. Cochran went back to racing. She bought a surplus P-51 and entered the 1946 Bendix, and came in second after a harrowing cross-country run that left her bruised and bloody. She ran the cosmetics business she had started in the 1930s between races and became a leading agitator for a separate Air Force. She spent thousands of her own dollars on advertisements pushing for an independent Air Force and raised more than 100,000 more to lobby and campaign. She used her fame and her husband, Floyd Odlum's connections, to open doors that might otherwise have been closed. And when the National Security Act of 1947 created an independent Air Force, she deserved much of the credit. 3 years later, the Harmon Trophy Selection Committee named Cochran the most outstanding woman aviator of the 1940s.
And then when she conned her way into Canadair, who her husband, Floyd Odlum, owned quite a bit, and they hired her as a test pilot. She said, I'm going to fly an F-86 and set some women's speed records, and men's too.
Flying a Canadian-built F-86 in 1953, she became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. She became the first woman to fly a jet across the Atlantic in 1962. And on a single stunning flight from New Orleans to Hanover, Germany, she set 69 intercity, intercapital, and straight-line speed records. In 1963, she capped her career by flying a Lockheed Starfighter faster than any woman had ever flown before.
Funny thing was, when Lockheed had a press conference down at Los Angeles International Airport, we took a F-104 and I flew her wing down there. Well, when she landed, I went on a round, was going on back to Edwards. I didn't want to get involved in the press conference. And I went over to the ground control frequency. I heard her check in with the ground control at Los Angeles International Airport. And then they called her and she didn't answer. And they called her again, she didn't answer. I said, if you look through your binoculars, you see she got her helmet off, combing her hair. And because she never got out of that airplane, that she didn't look like she stepped out of Vogue magazine.
Jackie and Chuck were extremely close. Jackie, in many ways, pushed and goaded Chuck to the point that he frequently threw his hands up and was going to walk away from her forever, but could never quite do it because she was a dynamic force and he was a dynamic force. And I think they both understood the magic of flight, the competitiveness of flight. They both had that element that you see in test pilots and fighter pilots.
In 1971, Jackie Cochran was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. In 1977, Congress passed a resolution recognizing the WASP contribution to the American war effort in World War II.
She set one heck of a lot of records in airplanes, and a lot of those records still stand. And I think she really made a big difference in women in aviation, which today there's thousands and thousands of gals that are flying in the military, airlines, private aviation, and she probably is largely responsible for their success.
In 1979, the members of the WASP began receiving their military discharge papers. It had taken some time, but Cochran had succeeded. She and her WASPs had indeed become a part of the military.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.